The most dangerous betrayal is never the one the kingdom sees. It is the one that quietly steals a heart that once believed it was safe. Every soul in Ashen Hollow believed King Cale Ashford and Queen Evelyn Ashford were blessed by destiny itself. Songs were written about the day the Alpha King had chosen the gentle Omega, whose quiet strength calmed storms no warrior could conquer. Children chased each other through village streets pretending to be the royal couple, while elders smiled and whispered that perhaps the moon goddess had finally rewarded the kingdom with rulers whose love would outlive every winter. On the morning the victorious army returned home, the capital shimmered beneath silver banners that stretched across every stone avenue. Church bells echoed through the crisp autumn air as merchants closed their shops to welcome the soldiers who had defended the northern territories. Thousands gathered outside Ironcrest Palace, cheering until their voices blended into a single wave of celebration. Evelyn stood beside her husband on the palace balcony, wearing a simple ivory gown beneath the royal cloak that marked her as queen. She never loved jewels as much as she loved seeing ordinary families reunited. While nobles admired her elegance, she watched children running toward fathers they feared they would never see again. That had always been her gift. She noticed hearts before crowns. Beside her, Cale accepted endless praise with the composed confidence expected of an alpha king. Years of leadership had taught him to hide exhaustion behind calm eyes and measured smiles. Yet when the procession reached its final carriage, something inside his expression shifted so subtly that almost no one noticed. The crowd fell into respectful silence as Lydia Hart stepped down wearing black mourning clothes instead of celebration colors. She was the widow of General Nathan Hart, the commander who had given his life protecting the king during the final days of the campaign. Her face carried quiet dignity despite unbearable grief, and the entire kingdom lowered their heads to honor her sacrifice. Without hesitation, Cale descended the palace steps himself. Instead of waiting for royal attendants, he walked directly toward Lydia and gently offered his hand to help her across the final stone stair. The crowd praised their king's compassion. Evelyn smiled softly like everyone else. After all, what kind of queen would resent kindness shown to a widow who had already lost everything? She never imagined that one small gesture, hidden beneath applause and good intentions, would become the first crack in a love story the entire kingdom believed could never break. The days that followed settled into a rhythm so ordinary that no one thought to question it. Every morning, reports from the rebuilding effort arrived at the royal council chamber, and every afternoon King Cale insisted on reviewing the welfare of the families who had lost loved ones during the campaign. Among every name written across those pages, Lydia Hart's appeared more often than the rest. She had refused special privileges, choosing instead to remain in the modest estate that had once belonged to her late husband. The decision earned admiration from the nobles and affection from the people. Cale visited to ensure she lacked nothing, first accompanied by advisors, then by captains, and eventually with only a single royal guard waiting respectfully outside. No one considered it improper. After all, the widow of the kingdom's greatest general deserved compassion. Evelyn believed the same. She personally arranged financial support for the soldiers' families, expanded the royal scholarship for orphan children, and instructed palace staff to deliver fresh food and winter blankets throughout the northern villages. Whenever Cale mentioned Lydia's struggles, Evelyn listened with sincere concern. She even suggested inviting Lydia to palace gatherings, so the young widow would not spend every evening alone surrounded by memories that were impossible to escape. At first, those dinners were quiet and respectful. Lydia rarely smiled. She thanked the servants for every cup of tea and apologized whenever conversations drifted toward happier times. Cale often encouraged her to share stories about General Nathan's courage, saying that heroes deserve to be remembered by more than monuments carved from stone. Evelyn admired the kindness in those moments. She watched her husband patiently listen without interrupting, and her heart felt proud rather than threatened. Yet seasons have a way of revealing changes too gradual to notice all at once. Winter approached, and Cale began extending council meetings so he could personally review rebuilding projects connected to the late general's command. Lydia became a familiar presence inside the palace library, studying maps and supply records because she understood her husband's unfinished work better than anyone else. Courtiers praised the arrangement as practical. Ministers called it wise leadership. Even the palace servants repeated that the king possessed a generous heart. Evelyn never argued. Instead, she quietly noticed details that no one else seemed to see. Cale laughed more easily when Lydia managed a genuine smile after weeks of grief. He remembered small things she mentioned in passing, like her favorite blend of mountain tea, or the music Nathan had once enjoyed during harvest festivals. When council sessions ended, he sometimes walked her through the palace gardens before returning to his own chambers. None of those moments were inappropriate by themselves. None crossed a line that could be named. Still, something invisible had begun to shift, like the first cool breeze before the arrival of snow. One evening, while arranging fresh flowers in the royal sitting room, Evelyn overheard two young maids whispering near the open window. They quickly lowered their voices the moment they realized she was nearby, but one sentence drifted clearly across the room before silence returned. They said the king looked happiest whenever Lady Lydia forgot to be sad. Evelyn paused with a white rose still in her hand. She did not feel anger. She did not feel jealousy. What settled quietly inside her was something far more unsettling. For the very first time since becoming queen, she wondered whether kindness, when left without boundaries, could slowly become something neither heart had ever intended. Snow fell quietly over Ironcrest Palace, covering rooftops and stone courtyards in a blanket so pure that it seemed impossible for anything painful to exist beneath it. Evelyn had always loved the first snowfall because it softened the sharp edges of the kingdom, making every tower and every road appear peaceful. This year, however, the silence felt different. It lingered too long in empty hallways. It waited outside closed doors. It followed her through rooms that once echoed with easy laughter between husband and wife. Cale had become busier than ever, or at least that was what everyone believed. Meetings stretched into the evening. Rebuilding plans demanded constant attention. Reports from distant provinces arrived at all hours. Whenever Evelyn asked whether he would join her for dinner, he answered with the same gentle apology and promised to make time tomorrow. Tomorrow slowly became another tomorrow and then another. She never complained. Love had taught her patience long before it had given her a crown. One evening, the palace prepared for the annual winter lantern gathering, a quiet tradition reserved for families honoring those they had lost. Evelyn expected Cale to stand beside her before the people as he always had. Instead, a messenger arrived moments before the ceremony began. The king had been delayed while meeting Lady Lydia regarding matters connected to General Nathan's Memorial Foundation. Evelyn nodded with calm grace and attended the gathering alone. No one questioned her smile. Queens learned early that some emotions belonged only to empty rooms. After the ceremony ended, she dismissed her attendants and decided to walk through the palace gardens before returning to her chambers. Fresh snow covered every path, untouched except for a single trail of footprints leading toward the old glass conservatory where exotic flowers bloomed throughout every season. Warm light spilled softly through the frosted windows. Evelyn slowed without knowing why. Through the delicate patterns of ice covering the glass, she saw Cale standing only a few feet away from Lydia. The widow's shoulders trembled as tears slipped quietly down her face while she held a folded letter in her hands. Cale spoke words Evelyn could not hear, his expression filled with sincere concern. Then, without hesitation, he reached forward and gently brushed a tear from Lydia's cheek before taking both of her hands in his. The gesture lasted only a few moments. There was no embrace, no kiss, no declaration of forbidden love. Yet something inside Evelyn shattered with a silence louder than thunder. She understood in an instant that the deepest wounds were not always created by dramatic betrayals. Sometimes they were born when comfort, tenderness, and emotional closeness slowly found a new home where they no longer belonged. She stepped backward before either of them noticed her presence. The snow beneath her shoes remained undisturbed except for the faint marks she left behind as she turned away. By the time Cale finally returned to their private chambers later that night, Evelyn was already sitting beside the fireplace with a book resting unopened in her lap. She welcomed him with the same gentle smile she had worn every evening since the day they married. Cale apologized for working late once again, and she simply wished him a peaceful night. He never realized she had seen everything. He never noticed that she did not ask where he had been. And perhaps the saddest part of all was that Evelyn no longer needed an explanation. The answer she feared had already been written, not in words, but in the quiet tenderness she had watched through a window covered with winter frost. The palace did not change overnight, but Evelyn did. She stopped waiting by the dining table until the candles burned low. She stopped glancing toward the grand entrance whenever footsteps echoed through the marble halls. She stopped asking the royal tailor to prepare matching colors for public appearances because she already knew most ceremonies would find her standing alone. The difference was so quiet that no one recognized it as heartbreak. They mistook it for maturity, for confidence, for the calm dignity expected from a queen who understood the burdens of ruling beside an alpha king. Kale noticed only that she had become easier to live with. She never questioned his schedule. She never asked about Lydia. She greeted him each morning with the same gentle smile and wished him success before every council meeting. To him, it seemed that Evelyn trusted him completely. He never realized trust had already become something she was carefully placing to rest instead of something she continued to build. During the following weeks, Evelyn devoted herself entirely to the kingdom. She visited schools where young wolves learned to read, spent afternoons helping healers organize medicine for remote villages, and quietly funded small businesses started by families who had lost everything during the war. The people adored their queen because she listened more than she spoke. Mothers brought infants for blessings. Elderly couples thanked her for remembering their names. Children raced across snowy streets simply to wave when her carriage passed. Those moments filled her heart with warmth, yet every evening she returned to a palace that somehow felt larger and emptier than before. One afternoon, while reviewing charitable accounts inside the royal library, Evelyn discovered a stack of documents waiting for Kale's signature. Mixed among military reports and rebuilding budgets was a request approving another private allocation for Lydia's estate. Evelyn read every page carefully before placing them back exactly where she had found them. The amount itself did not trouble her. The kingdom could easily afford generosity. What lingered in her thoughts was the handwritten note attached to the final page. It was not formal. It was personal. Kale had written that Lydia should never hesitate to ask him directly if she needed anything at all. Evelyn gently folded the paper closed. She did not cry. She simply sat in silence until the afternoon sunlight slowly drifted across the wooden desk. That evening, Kale returned earlier than expected. He found Evelyn arranging fresh flowers inside their private sitting room, humming a melody she had loved since childhood. He smiled with genuine relief, grateful to find peace after another demanding day. For a moment, he almost reached for her hand. Instead, a servant entered with a message saying Lydia wished to discuss preparations for the upcoming memorial ceremony honoring General Nathan. Kale apologized almost automatically and promised he would not be long. Evelyn looked into his silver eyes with the same warmth he had fallen in love with years before and softly told him there was no need to hurry home. The words sounded kind, but they carried a meaning he could not hear. She no longer expected him to choose her. After he left, Evelyn walked alone through the royal residence, stopping in every room that held memories of happier years. She smiled at portraits painted during festivals, touched the polished banister where Kale had once teased her for nearly tripping over her gown, and paused outside the balcony where they had welcomed the kingdom after their wedding. None of those memories felt bitter. They felt complete, like the final pages of a beautiful book that had quietly reached its ending long before either reader realized the story was over. In that stillness, without anger or resentment, Evelyn finally made a decision that would change not only her own future, but the destiny of the crown itself. Before sunrise, Ironcrest Palace rested beneath a sky the color of pale silver, and for the first time since becoming queen, Evelyn awoke without wondering whether today would be different. She already knew the answer. Hope had quietly slipped away long before the morning arrived. She dressed herself without calling for attendance, choosing a simple cream traveling gown instead of royal velvet. Every jewel remained inside its carved wooden case. Every ceremonial sash stayed folded exactly where it belonged. She had worn the symbols of a queen with gratitude, but she refused to mistake them for the measure of her worth. Carrying only a small leather satchel, she crossed the silent chambers one last time. The room still held traces of the life they had built together. Fresh flowers stood beside the window because Kale had once said he loved waking to their fragrance. A warm blanket rested across the reading chair where they had spent winter evenings sharing stories about the villages they hoped to visit together someday. None of those memories were false. That was what made leaving so difficult. Their happiness had been real. It simply had not remained enough. Evelyn. walked to the writing desk and unfolded a sheet of thick ivory paper bearing the royal seal. She paused for several long moments before placing the pen against the page. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She did not mention Lydia's name even once. Instead, she thanked Cale for every season they had shared, wished him wisdom as king, and admitted the truth she could no longer ignore. A marriage could survive hardship, distance, and sacrifice, but it could not survive the slow disappearance of being the person someone turned toward first. She signed only her name, leaving behind neither title nor crown. Beside the letter, she placed the silver wedding ring Cale had slipped onto her finger beneath the full moon years earlier. The metal caught the first rays of dawn as though refusing to let go of the light. Then she removed the royal crest from her cloak and laid it beside the ring. Outside her private chamber waited the captain of the palace guard, expecting to escort the queen to the morning council session. Evelyn thanked him for his years of loyal service and quietly instructed him not to announce her departure until the palace bells rang for breakfast. The captain looked confused, but something in her calm expression kept him from asking questions. He bowed deeply and stepped aside. No royal carriage rolled through the gates. No procession followed behind her. Evelyn left on foot through the eastern garden entrance where she had often walked with Cale during the earliest days of their marriage. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she crossed the stone bridge overlooking the frozen stream. She never looked back. Beyond the palace walls, merchants were only beginning to open their shops, and children laughed while chasing one another through the fresh snow, unaware that their queen had already become an ordinary traveler. By the time the sun climbed above the distant mountains, Evelyn Ashford had disappeared into the quiet roads leading south, carrying little more than a change of clothes, a few family keepsakes, and the peaceful certainty that choosing herself was not an act of anger. It was the final expression of a love that refused to beg for a place where it no longer belonged. King Cale returned to the royal residence just before noon, expecting another ordinary day shaped by council meetings, rebuilding reports, and the familiar comfort of knowing Evelyn would be somewhere within the palace walls. A servant greeted him with an uneasy expression and lowered his eyes before speaking. The queen had not attended breakfast. At first, Cale barely reacted. Evelyn often spent mornings visiting schools or meeting with village healers, and her absence never caused concern. He thanked the servant and continued toward their private chambers, already thinking about the afternoon schedule. When he opened the door, the silence felt strangely unfamiliar. The fireplace had gone cold. Fresh flowers still rested by the window, yet the room carried the stillness of a place that had already said goodbye. His gaze settled on the writing desk. There, resting neatly beside the royal crest, lay a silver ring he recognized instantly. His heart tightened before his mind understood why. Cale crossed the room in hurried steps and picked up the folded letter bearing Evelyn's graceful handwriting. As he read each line, the color slowly drained from his face. There were no accusations. No vitternis. No attempt to make him feel guilty. She thanked him for the years they had shared. She wished peace upon the kingdom. She wrote that she hoped he would always lead with wisdom and compassion. Then came the sentence that refused to leave his thoughts. She could not remain where she no longer felt like the first place his heart returned to. Cale read those words again and again until the ink blurred before his eyes. He searched the room as though Evelyn might somehow step out from behind a curtain and gently tell him everything was a misunderstanding. Instead, he found empty shelves where a few personal books had once stood and an open wardrobe missing only the simplest traveling clothes. Everything valuable remained behind. She had taken nothing that belonged to the crown because she no longer considered herself part of it. The captain of the palace guard was summoned immediately. His voice trembled as he explained that the queen had instructed him not to announce her departure until after breakfast. She had spoken calmly. She had smiled. She had thanked every servant she encountered on her way through the eastern garden. No one imagined she was leaving forever. Cale rushed through the palace corridors, ignoring the startled expressions of ministers and attendants. He reached the eastern gate where fresh snow still preserved a single trail of footprints leading away from the palace before fading into the busy roads beyond the city. He stared at those fading marks for a long time without moving. For months he had convinced himself that Evelyn's quiet understanding meant everything was well between them. He believed her silence was peace when in truth, It had been farewell slowly taking shape. His memories returned with painful clarity. Every dinner she ate alone without complaint. Every gentle smile that hid disappointment. Every promise that he would come home sooner next time. None of those moments had seemed important while they were happening. Standing before the empty road, Cale finally understood that love rarely disappeared in a single day. It faded through 1,000 unnoticed choices until one morning the person waiting beside you simply stopped waiting at all. By the second day, the palace no longer felt like the center of the kingdom. It felt like a place where something precious had quietly vanished, leaving behind only routines that no longer carried warmth. Ministers continued presenting reports. Guards changed shifts with perfect discipline. Courtiers bowed as King Cale entered every chamber. Yet beneath every formal greeting lingered the same unspoken question. Where was the queen everyone loved? Rumors traveled faster than winter winds. Merchants whispered that Queen Evelyn had chosen an ordinary life over a lonely throne. Mothers repeated stories of her kindness while buying bread in crowded markets. Elderly veterans recalled the afternoons she had personally visited wounded soldiers without bringing musicians or royal announcements. No one spoke against their king with open disrespect, but for the first time in years, the people's admiration no longer belonged entirely to the crown. It followed the woman who had quietly walked away from it. Cale ordered trusted scouts to search every southern road, every village and every mountain pass. He instructed them to offer assistance, not force. If anyone found Evelyn, they were to tell her only one thing. The king wished to speak with her. Hours turned into days, and every report returned with the same answer. She had been seen helping an elderly traveler repair a wagon. She had purchased warm bread from a roadside bakery. She had thanked strangers with the same gentle smile the kingdom remembered. Then she had continued walking before anyone realized who she truly was. It was as though the world itself had decided to protect her peace. Inside the palace, Lydia Hart noticed the change before anyone else dared mention it. Cale no longer lingered during conversations. He answered questions with distracted silence and often found himself staring toward windows overlooking the eastern gate. One afternoon Lydia requested a private audience. She thanked him once again for every kindness he had shown since Nathan's passing, but before Cale could respond, she quietly asked the question he had spent weeks avoiding. Had the queen left because of them? Cale lowered his eyes for the first time since becoming king. He admitted he did not know. Lydia closed her eyes, remembering every conversation, every walk through the gardens, every moment she had accepted comfort without recognizing what it might cost someone else. Tears gathered quietly, not from romantic longing, but from painful understanding. Evelyn had never treated her with resentment. She had welcomed her into the palace, defended her dignity before suspicious nobles, and ensured she never faced grief alone. Lydia suddenly realized that the greatest kindness she had ever received might have become the deepest source of another woman's loneliness. The next morning she packed her belongings and requested permission to leave the capital. She explained that General Nathan deserved to be honored through the charitable foundation they had created, but she could no longer remain where every hallway reminded the kingdom of what had been lost. Before departing, Lydia left Cale with only a single sentence. A queen does not leave because another woman arrives. She leaves when the man she trusted slowly forgets to walk beside her. Those words followed Cale long after the carriage disappeared beyond the palace gates. Standing alone beneath the gray winter sky, he finally understood that this was never a story about choosing between two women. It was about the countless ordinary moments when he had unknowingly stopped choosing the one who had already given him everything. Nearly 3 months passed before a messenger finally returned with news that sounded too ordinary to be true. The former queen had been seen in a small mountain town nearly 200 miles south of Ironcrest, a peaceful place where travelers stopped only long enough to rest before continuing west. She was not living in a grand estate or hiding beneath a false name. She rented a modest cottage beside a family-owned bakery, and spent her mornings teaching children to read while helping elderly neighbors carry firewood or mend torn clothing. The messenger hesitated before adding one final detail. The people there did not know her as a queen. They simply knew her as Evelyn, the kind woman who always smiled first. Cale left the capital before sunrise the following morning with only 2 guards, dismissing the rest before reaching the mountain roads. The journey took several days through forests dusted with melting snow and quiet valleys where spring had already begun to wake the earth. Every mile gave him more time to remember moments he had once considered too ordinary to treasure. Evelyn laughing because he had burned breakfast during their first winter together. Evelyn falling asleep while reading beside the fireplace. Evelyn reaching for his hand during village festivals without caring who watched. He realized those memories had never disappeared. He had simply stopped noticing them while chasing responsibilities he believed could not wait. When Cale finally reached the mountain town, no one recognized the Alpha King beneath his plain traveling coat. Following the directions given by the village baker, he walked toward a small community garden behind the schoolhouse. There, beneath the soft afternoon sunlight, he saw her. Evelyn knelt beside a little girl who was struggling to plant wildflowers in the rich spring soil. She laughed as the child accidentally covered both of their hands with dirt, and the sound carried gently across the quiet garden. It was not the careful smile she had worn inside the palace. It was open, effortless, and wonderfully free. Cale remained frozen where he stood. For the first time in many months, he saw not the queen of an empire but the woman he had fallen in love with long before either of them wore a crown. She looked healthier than she had in years. The constant exhaustion had vanished from her eyes. Peace had replaced it. Eventually Evelyn looked up and saw him standing near the wooden gate. Surprise crossed her face for only a heartbeat before it settled into calm recognition. She excused herself from the children and slowly walked toward him. Neither of them spoke immediately. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers between them, replacing the cold silence that had once filled the palace halls. Cale searched her face for anger but found none. There was no bitterness, no resentment, only quiet acceptance. Somehow that gentle peace hurt him far more than anger ever could have. He softly asked whether she had been happy here. Evelyn glanced toward the children laughing in the garden before answering with complete honesty. She said she had finally remembered what it felt like to wake each morning without wondering whether she was becoming invisible to the person she loved most. Cale lowered his eyes because he understood exactly what she meant. In that simple mountain town, far from royal ceremonies and towering castles, he came face to face with the painful truth that the greatest gift he had ever been given had learned how to smile again only after walking away from him. Cale stood in silence for what felt like an eternity, watching the gentle breeze move through the wildflowers surrounding the small garden. At last he stepped forward, not as the Alpha King who commanded an entire kingdom, but as a man who had finally understood the cost of taking quiet love for granted. His voice was softer than Evelyn had ever heard it. He admitted that he had mistaken her patience for endless strength and her silence for peace. He confessed that every mile leading to this little town had forced him to relive countless moments when he could have chosen differently. He had believed that providing safety, prosperity, and stability was enough, never realizing that the person waiting beside him had needed something much simpler. She had only wanted to remain the place his heart returned to first. Evelyn listened without interrupting. There had been a time when hearing those words would have brought tears to her eyes. Now they settled gently in her heart like rain falling upon soil that had already begun to heal. Cale slowly lowered himself onto one knee, caring nothing for the curious glances of villagers passing along the nearby road. Pride had once been effortless for a king. Humility demanded far greater courage. He asked her to return with him, promising that he would spend the rest of his life earning back the trust he had failed to protect. The garden became completely still. Even the children playing nearby seemed to lower their voices without knowing why. Evelyn looked at the man she had once believed she would grow old beside. She saw sincerity in his eyes. She believed every apology he offered. She believed his regret was real. That was what made her answer so difficult. With gentle kindness, she reached down and encouraged him to stand. She told him she had forgiven him long before he found her. Holding on to bitterness would only have imprisoned her heart, and she had chosen freedom instead. But forgiveness, she quietly explained, was not the same as returning. Some paths could not be walked backward simply because both travelers wished they could begin again. Cale closed his eyes as those words settled into the deepest part of his soul. For the first time, he truly understood that love was never protected by grand gestures made too late. It survived through ordinary moments, through daily choices, through remembering who should never have to compete for a place that already belonged to them. Evelyn smiled one last time, the same warm smile that had once filled every room inside Ironcrest Palace with light. Then she turned toward the waiting children, who eagerly called her name as they held tiny flower seedlings in their hands. She walked back to them without hesitation, her steps light and certain. Cale remained where he stood, watching the woman he would always love disappear into a life built not upon crowns or titles, but upon peace. When he finally began the long journey home, the road seemed quieter than ever before. He still wore the crown of an Alpha King, but he carried with him a lesson no throne could teach. The greatest victories are never won by power alone, and the deepest love in the world quietly fades the moment someone stops choosing it, one ordinary day at a time.